Московского урбанистического форума 2018. Для ключевого выступления на сцену приглашается мэр Москвы Сергей Семенович Собянин.
Добрый день, дорогие друзья.
Good morning, friends. This is the 7th year that we gather in Moscow in order to respond to the challenges we face today, the challenges that the cities of the world face today. During all those years, we have heard a lot of ideas, a lot of theories, and a lot of stories about various practices. And I'm grateful to all of you, to all those who thinks genuinely about the future of our cities, the future of Moscow. It is very useful to us, everything you say, you sharing your experience, your ideas. To many of us, things we discuss at the Urban Forum are theory, wonderful ideas, but to others, they are our practice, what we do every day in our work. To me personally, 7 years ago, this became a challenge of a lifetime. 7 years ago, we thought how we should continue developing one of the world's largest city, the biggest mega city in Europe. Russian cities are very much different from European ones. For example, for 7 decades, they developed following a totally different paradigm. This is just one of the reasons. They were part of the Soviet Union. And the changes that we saw in recent decades were tremendous. European cities took centuries to go through those changes, and we had to take giant leaps in just a few years. Still, we should always remember about our past, what we went through, and where we are going. Of course, we have to answer the question of what Moscow will look like tomorrow. Just recently, in the 1980s, Moscow was in a totally different era of its development. It was an industrial city. In the early 80s, I worked for a large metal plant. They had 12,000 employees, and right next to us there was another plant with 45,000 employees, and on the whole, this area had 5 or 6 metal works, where dozens of thousands of people working at each of those companies. Then I moved to the Arctic and our company drilled for oil there. And cities, they just stood in the way. Unfortunately, we had to build cities, but they stood in the way of drilling. They stood in the way of the industry, but we still had to do something so people can live somewhere, have housing and work. I know it's hard to believe, but there was a decision made by the Communist Party banning the construction of sporting facilities, building stores, developing cities in Western Siberia. There was a ban on that. The city of Tyumen was the dirtiest place in Russia, even though it produced 2/3 of all oil and 90% of all natural gas. Everything was done for the industry. Everything else was not even secondary. It was totally neglected. Moscow had huge plants in the 1980s. That's the first question that the mayor of Moscow would be asked by communist functionaries. What about the industry? What about the plants? How much you have produced? How many cars? How many machines? Moscow was a city of plants. And then in the late 1980s, even the Soviet leaders began to realize that this is a path that leads to nowhere. Then perestroika started, and one step after another, we began to change our city. We had a period of wild capitalism. It was free for all. Do what you please, go wherever you please, park your car wherever you please, build whatever you want, any place. It doesn't matter. It's just as long as you can provide a kickback, share some of your wealth with bureaucrats. What next? This was the question. In 2010, this was the question we faced. We had a feeling that Moscow was on a road to nowhere, and we would face a transport impasse. There was less and less space for people. The city was getting less and less comfortable for people. It was unfriendly. One option was to do nothing, to take the evolutionary way, let the city drift on in the same direction for a few more years. Or we could take the road of gradual, small changes, baby steps, seeing that this city was very much lagging behind its competitors, other cities. And this approach would mean that Moscow would become incompetitive, would lose its competitive edge. All the other cities around the world took a different approach. They were not working for industries, for plants, not for just an abstract idea of a man. No, they were working for people. The biggest asset of each city is people living there, people with their talents, their capabilities, with their ingenuity, creativity. It's easy to say, I love my city. We like to say that, of course, but does our city love us back? Is this love mutual? And what do we have to do so we can say this city loves us back? This is a city for me. When you go out of your apartment and you immerse yourself in the urban environment, your yard, is it nice? Is it comfortable? You take a road, the road should welcome you. You use transport. Transport has to be comfortable. Your kids go to school, so you should feel that your child will be expected there. will be welcome there. You go to a hospital, you receive all sorts of services. The entire city should serve people's need. Then this will be a city for people, city for the man. The man is the center of the city. Let me give you a few examples. Theoretically, it all sounds nice, but when we look at practical examples, the picture is somewhat different. This is Nikolskaya Street. Now the whole world knows about it. Billions of people around the world saw Nikolskaya Street. But neither millions nor billions knew what it looked like just a few years ago. This is what it used to look like. It's a modern city. This is 2013. This is Birzhevaya Square. I'm grateful to the Ministry of Finance. It's their cars that used to be parked there. They agreed to remove them off the square. So this is what Birzhevaya Square looks like today. And we had the World Cup, of course, and we were able to stand this test. Millions of people from all over the globe came to our city. In 2010, Moscow would not have survived the World Cup. It looks simple, but for all these changes to take place, you need to work in a systemic, consistent way. You need to resolve all sorts of conflicts. You need to fight advertising companies, fight the owners of cables that used to run across the street over people's heads. You need to fix the situation with the billboards, with advertising. You need to remove kiosks and old pavilions off the streets. On each of those decisions was a little revolution in and of itself. And let me give you another example. This is what Zaryadye used to look like. This is in the 90s. Actually, perhaps this is not the worst possible solution. It's a mega hotel in the very center of the city. But it was taken down, and instead they made a decision to build a rich neighborhood with elite housing for the richest people in Moscow. I doubt that those streets would be accessible to ordinary people. A lot of investment, a lot of revenue, a lot of property taxes. One would think that this is what the city needs. Thank you. I would like to thank the President of the Russian Federation. He supported a different idea. He said we should turn this area into a park. And today, we are at the very heart of this new park, in this wonderful concert hall, one of the best concert halls in the world. Oh, you would say, so what? What's so special about it? Well, this park connected pedestrian streets, great monuments of Moscow, and every year it attracts about 10 million people. This is a point that connects our city. It's a symbol of transformations of living space currently happening in our city. We have done a lot. Hundreds of streets, hundreds of parks, thousands of yards. And it would seem that this is a huge project, and that's enough. That's a lot. But look at the map of Moscow. This is what we have done. And it's just 10% of what we need to do. When I meet people, they ask me, Mr. mayor, this is also nice and fine, but what about our street? What about our neighborhood? When can we have something similar to that? So that's the next step. We shouldn't just say my city. We should say my street, my neighborhood, my park, my yard. This is our living space. This is the city we live in. This is the city we love. I always get asked a lot of questions. Of course, people say Moscow is so rich and you have lots of money you can spend. Well, I have to tell you that this project turned out to be the most economically viable project. We get a return on our investment within 1 or 2 years. By the way, the same goes for investing in sporting infrastructure. We did not prepare our city in a special way for the World Cup. The only venue that we worked on specifically for the World Cup was Luzhniki Stadium. It was 25 billion rubles, but even this investment, we got half of the return in just a month. Let me give you another example from a different area. Children, of course, are the most important thing in our life. This is our biggest asset. And everything depends on what kind of education they get. This will determine their future. And this determines the future of the city. Does our city have a future or not? Moscow has always had a very fine education system, wonderful schools. Some headmasters were known across the nation and even worldwide. But you know what the problem was? We had a few dozen excellent schools, wonderful schools, and then we had a huge number of different kind of schools which could not offer quality education. There was no equality, no equal opportunity. Schools would get totally different levels of funding. They were elite schools and schools for ordinary children. Most schools have their students doomed to get lower quality education. And they would start their career at a lower level. They did not get an equal chance, equal opportunity. It all comes down to funding. This funding was not based on the number of students or on the quality of education provided. After certain reforms, basically this was a high school revolution. We changed the funding system. We made students the center of the education system. Now everything depends on the student. Determines the situation of teachers, the situation of the school itself, and this changed the quality of education dramatically. The quality of education improved, almost doubled. And now, no matter which school you go to, you get good education there. People often tell me, okay, now you have created a level playing field. Now everybody's at the same level. It's all gray. Well, let me tell you that Moscow students won more than half of all the prizes in the National Olympiad, National School Contest. And this means that we don't just have a level playing field, we have created excellent opportunities for a large number of children. Opportunities which they did not used to have. They can get much better education now and they can use their talents. Moscow schools, we can compare them not only to schools in other Russian cities. You can tell us you're ahead of the rest of Russia because the situation in the rest of Russia is so poor. No. You know, there was a study done by the OECD, and they pay a lot of attention to education. They ranked Moscow number 6 in the rankings of different global cities. We are ahead of Finland, which is ranked 2nd in the world. What next? Next, we'll have other projects implemented. We will make classes more interesting. We will use digital technology. We will work. We worked with our teachers, and we have created e-school project. It's iPads, electronic, digital blackboards. All teachers in Moscow got involved in this project. We all know about Wikipedia, right? Well, the Moscow e-school project is similar to Wikipedia, but Wikipedia is something that the whole world works on. And then they just have a small group of experts. It's 70,000 teachers that work on the Moscow e-school project. Dozens of thousands of students are involved in this project. A large number of people who help prepare educational content. This is truly a popular project. Teachers upload their version of a class, of a course, and other teachers can use it. It's a democratic process. It's a breakthrough project. In just a few months, we received dozens of thousands of scripts for classes, and some of them are real masterpieces, and lots of teachers around the city use those. This helps us create individual studying trajectory for students, grade their progress, and this makes us more and more competitive compared to other parts of Russia and the rest of the world. But the most important thing, students should know this is my school, this is my teacher, this is my future. Now let me give you another example from a different area. Infrastructure. Cities cannot survive without quality transport infrastructure. It's impossible. If you have a village or a small settlement with a population of 100 people, 200,000, but where you have a city of 10 million people, an agglomeration of 20 million people, you cannot possibly survive without transport infrastructure. What we inherited from the Soviet period is a large railway system. For a long time, we tried to get rid of it. Many cities get rid of their railways, creating roads instead, or parks. But there is a different way to go about it. We had a wonderful ring road that would, it was called MKZD, Moscow Ring Railway. After the industrial system of Moscow collapsed, it was a rusty ring railroad that went through Moscow, through depressive industrial zones, and it wasn't really used. Some people say, yeah, we need to preserve this railroad as a cargo railroad, but I'm really grateful to Russian Railways. They agreed with us that we need a different approach. We created infrastructure that connected many parts of Moscow. This opened new opportunities for transport accessibility. This took some burden off the metro ring line, connected Moscow railway stations. And of course, we realized that we need to make it convenient. We need nice views out the window. We need quality trains and a good level of service. We made this project for people. Of course, we should continue developing the metro system, reach every neighborhood so that all people in Moscow can easily use the subway system. We should always remember that we have about 8 million people living outside the city limits. 2.5 million people come to Moscow, commute to Moscow every day. For such an agglomeration, the metro system alone is not enough. So we need overground metro. We need to connect Moscow suburbs to the city per se. And we have developed such a project. We will implement it within the next few years. Moscow and the suburbs will receive 446 kilometers of overground metro within the next few years. Of course, we should always build roads, but those roads should not increase concentration in the center. It should make the situation more comfortable. We'll get 1,300 kilometers of new roads, and we will get 500 kilometers of overground and underground metro, 1,000 kilometers in total. We need to make all the places in the city easily accessible to people so that people can easily get to work, to theaters, movies. This is what will make our future successful. Many people commend our efforts. Experts, of course, are always skeptical. You know, there are all sorts of opinions, all sorts of ranking systems, but this is one opinion. This is basically an opinion poll. This is not done by experts. This is done by people. They rank Moscow very high. Another very important project. Your living space starts from your apartment, the place you live in. If you have a very nice building standing next to your building, and your building, is old and dilapidated, you will never feel comfortable living in such a situation. That's why we made a decision together with the people of Moscow that we put it up for a vote for each building separately. We have adopted the renovation program. We are now in stage 2. Stage 1 covered 450,000 people. Stage 2 will cover 1 million people. This is the biggest renovation project ever. We have the best Russian and international architects working on this project. Another project I have to mention is municipal services. The reason I want to mention this project is because this whole area is actually symbolic of the relationship between the man and the government, the authorities. Historically, we thought that this citizen and the state they have the kind of relationship like you have between a subordinate and the boss. This was the situation for centuries, and it seemed that it was impossible to change that. 97% of the people were unhappy with the situation, and we didn't know what to do. Still, even in this area, we were able to achieve serious changes. We have created new infrastructure, a new system for providing government services. So today, 97% of the people in Moscow say they are happy with the system. The next step would be not just to perform your functions in an formal way. No, we need to make those services genuine. You need to go beyond the barriers. The person working in this area should genuinely help you in a caring way. This would be the next step in providing government services for us. You will never feel comfortable in the city unless people get involved in governance. A big city should have a system which allows people to get involved, but this is very difficult. I would say this is the most difficult part. This is the most difficult problem, getting people involved. A few hundred people would go out into the street and say, "We are Muscovites. Listen to us. We tell you this is what you need to do." But you can only have a few hundred or a few thousand people. Do they really reflect the interests of millions of people? So, in order for us to understand what people really want, to get people really involved in governance, in managing the city, we have created, for example, the Our City portal, where you can monitor the way municipal systems work. 90% of the problems people face on a daily basis, they can report those problems through this website, and they will get a response. Within 4 days on the average, those problems get resolved. Also, we have a special application, special software, which you can use to complain against people who violate parking rules. And it's important for people to have referenda on various issues. We have the Active Citizen program. We got 2 million people involved. We had 3,600 questions put up for a vote. All sorts of issues, parks, schools, and so on. So we come up, we don't just raise questions, people come up with solutions. This is one of the biggest discussion platforms that works around the clock in Moscow. It is really important to get people involved in managing the city. Of course, there's a classical system. You have elections, parliamentarism, NGOs. This is all fun, but the world we live in today, you can use new approaches, new opportunities in it. Well, you can say you invent all sorts of things for Moscow because Moscow is such a rich city, but this would not work in other cities. And you're just spending cash. Let me tell you about investing in infrastructure, in social facilities. They generate huge boost for attracting investors. We increased investment by 76% over these years, and Moscow's revenue has grown proportionately. Moscow is free of any debt today, and we are confident that we will be able to implement most of our programs on our own. You know, when I found out that only 60% of the people in Moscow say that they definitely want to stay in their city and live here, and others think that maybe they would like to move to some other cities around the world, I was very disappointed. But then I found out that even the best city in the world, New York, has only 35% of the people who want to stay there. I realized that actually our situation is not that bad after all. It's very important when people compare us. It's not just us, people who visit Moscow. What tourists, our guests, think about Moscow is very important. These people have traveled throughout the world, and they compare Moscow to other places, the cities that they came from. It is really important. Our number one criterion in developing our city should be just this one principle. This should be a city which loves its citizens, and citizens should love their city. Thank you.
На сцену приглашаются
I would like to invite up to the stage moderator Kirill Androsov, the managing partner of Altera Capital, Elizabeth Diller, an architect, co-founder of the Dealers Cafeteria in Renfro, Bruce Katz, economist, the founder of New Localism Advisors, Rem Koolhaas, an architect, co-founder of the OMA Bureau, Alexei Kudrin, the chair of the Public Chamber Accountability Officer of the Russian Federation.
Добрый день. Форума.
good afternoon, dear forum participants, and dear Mr. Sobyanin. We are beginning our first plenary session, which is dedicated to the challenges which megapolises of the 21st centuries are facing. Moscow, as other global cities, is undergoing unprecedented transformation. And those technological, economic, and even demographic challenges which we are facing in the 21st century are requiring for new projects, be it in the transportation and culture. They require new management modules, and we have to meet the new requirements of the city people. And we have about 45 minutes now. We are planning to speak on these very topics, and the organizers of the forum invited these splendid experts to be our panelists. But before we engage in our discussion, I would like to couple of first questions to ask Sergei Sobyanin based on his initial presentation. Sergei, it has been less than 2 days since the World Cup was over. You've mentioned in your presentation, and I believe that it was amazing and outstanding event in terms of its sole potential and implemented effects, and also for Moscow dwellers, for the people in Russia in general. And I think it was the test and proof of all these projects that you've been implementing with your team in Moscow. I will not ask you how the Moscow stood this test. I know that it was a success, and this uplifted mood which the World Cup and Moscow brought not only to Muscovites but also to all of Russia, it's still felt on the streets, it's felt everywhere. I would like to ask you maybe a personal question which I'm interested in. And in this last month, when Moscow was undergoing through the World Cup, what were you surprised about the most? Maybe there was some message, some report, presentation about the World Cup, which gave you a new perspective about what was going on. Maybe whenever you have your regular morning reports by the heads of the public and utility sectors, and for instance, and when let's say you're told that we've had this and this in the city, what shall we do? Have you had any issues like that? We do have something to compare it with. Back in 1980, Moscow had held another illuminous event, Olympic Games. It was simply outstanding event. And back then I was in Moscow in passing, and the city was empty. It was sterile, you would think, because all the Muscovites were asked to leave, and all the guests were told, don't come again. And they had just the right people in the city, so to speak. Of course, the Olympic Games is a big celebration and a grand event, but it cannot compare to what was happening right now during this Mundial. Millions and millions of people who have come to Moscow the world over. And what I was surprised about, I thought that the most difficult would be to build the transport infrastructure in the city and to landscape the city, improve it. We have been doing this not for the championship, but simply to develop the city. And I was a little bit anxious about the Luzhniki Stadium because it was a very difficult reconstruction. We've saved the historic frame, but at the same time, we rebuilt it into a modern stadium. And later, I was a little bit concerned for people to make it in on time into stadium. 80,000 people gather in one stadium. Just imagine that. I was a little bit concerned about what was happening at the fan zone, which was initially built for 25,000 people. And then 100,000 people would come. But I was surprised the most when after the game between Spain and Russia, over 1 million city people got out to the streets of Moscow. They were celebrating until 5 a.m. It was a totally different environment and feeling. It was the spirit of oneness of all the fans and supporters and people of Moscow. And this spirit, which has been felt totally different during the World Cup. Moscow, which opened up in a totally different ways, its hospitality and smiles and just friendly touch and feelings. It was really amazing. And we're all hoping that this very feeling of hospitality, of friendliness, of kindness would stay after the World Cup. Thank you. I think that it's not up to every mayor of the major megapolis that they had to stand this test when millions of people would take to the streets, especially during the nighttime. Moscow withstood that. Sergei Semyonovich, the second question is that for all of us living in Moscow, the scale and scope of the changes we're witnessing, they're obvious. You can feel it whenever you are moving across the city, you go about your daily business. But even though they're saying that you have to start and you'll finish, but you can never finish what you do when you do a big-scale project. With your permission, I would like to ask you, what do you believe is the most important, one or two, three things which you and your team were not able to finish yet? What are your concerns? What is concerning you, Kirill? Do you believe that it is possible in a city like that to finish anything completely and put it to an end? A city is a dynamic mechanism, and every day it grows and morphs and develops. It's moving, it's expanding, and it is very important for the changes which are taking place in the city to happen in all areas of our lives and not to suppress our dynamism. And our goal is to make the city one of the best in the world. But we have to have an ambition to make it the best city on the earth. Thank you. And I guess it is the main project to make Moscow the best city ever. For me, this is the best answer. Thank you, Sergei. And now I would like to ask our experts, architects, economists, who are famous through their achievements in urbanism, in architecture, in our planet. And the first question, Elizabeth, I would like to ask you. Today we are here in this beautiful concert hall of the beautiful Zaryadye Park. As it was mentioned by Mr. Sobyanin in his report, you've been author of the concept of this idea. And I always thought that when an architect is conceptualizing certain venue, he or she is thinking about the key idea, about this backbone which should, hold this project. And what was for you personally that backbone, this key idea of this public space, of this location where we are today? Because it's a bit more than a park. And what long-term effects for Moscow, for the people of Moscow, maybe even beyond, you were counting when you were doing this conceptual work? Thank you.
Yes, so I was very happy to that the mayor reminded everyone of the history of the site. It was the site of the Hotel Rossiya, and then for a while it was considered to be a new commercial center, to use these 14 hectares for a commercial center of mixed use. And at a certain point, there was a decision to use the space as a public park. And this was an incredible opportunity for our studio to engage in what would be normally considered the prime piece of real estate of a city, right in the middle, and inside of this fantastic wealth of buildings and history, to make a new kind of vision for a park. And this is the first park in over 50 years in Moscow, the first new park. And we imagined something that we called the wild urbanism, which is to bring to maybe subvert some of the sort of conventions of making parks, to not use the typical normal plants, typical ways of making paths and leading to monuments and so forth, but to make a truly informal place that's a place where vegetation and humans could feel equally comfortable, and a place that's really for doing nothing. In our sort of society where every second is used in a very utilitarian and economic way, it's fantastic to have a place where one can do nothing. And so this is the value of parks today. So to have this opportunity to plan a park that is relatively pathless, that is quite wild, where people are not scripted and their ways of using the park are not scripted. This was the opportunity and the thing that we wanted to do, and also use passive systems to extend the shoulder season of the spring and fall and so forth. So there were many new things and ideas that we wanted to put into this park.
Спасибо. Если
Thank you. And if we will look beyond, let's say, 20 years from now, what's your vision of this place in Moscow, Park Zaryadye, let's say in 20, in 25 years in time? Let's fantasize what may be happening here in the future. Thanks.
So this is something that is almost impossible to to imagine if we could predict what people would do.
Что бы вы хотели, чтобы здесь?
Would you like to be happening here from your point of view?
I would love this, right now we see this great phenomenon of tourism here. We saw also a great response of 1 million people in the first month of the opening of the park. And I would love for the public to really take over the park, to be uninhibited, to gather in different ways, to be productive in different ways socially, for the park to be truly diverse, and for the park to actually help to transform all the edges and areas around it. Our experience with the High Line, which was the first major park we did in New York, it was a very tiny investment of the city in a park that was not even thought to be utilized in the future. Very much, it became a park of maybe 7 million or 8 million people that came last year, totally transformed, and it transformed the way people thought about parks, I think, globally. Touched on a nerve that, perhaps because we're on our gadgets all day and we're always productive, that the importance of public space is ever more important now as our cities are getting denser and more privatized. That there's actually space that's sanctioned for publicness. And for gathering, and the potential use of obsolete infrastructure and and in this case, it was not. We had a fantastic gift here, that there was a site that we could use entirely, but the value of the work on the High Line was that it woke up leaders all over the globe to think about the potential use of obsolete infrastructure in making social space. And it conjoins this need for publicness with a concern about energy and sustainability and limited resources. So putting all of that together in a very positive way. So we're very happy to sort of bring back the trend of parks.
Yeah. Beautiful dream. Спасибо.
Thank you. Mr. Katz, I would like to ask you the next question. You're consulting the CEOs and the heads of the many megapolises and the global cities about the transformational projects and processes. But Moscow, some 30 years ago, had been a big industrial city. And of course, industry remains one of priorities of developing Moscow. But still today, as far as I know, in Moscow there are over 1,500 of new formats I'm speaking about technoparks, innovative innovation centers, co-working spaces, which are being created also on the basis of those ex-industrial spaces and facilities which are still maybe present in the central part of Moscow. We've been speaking about technological challenges of the 21st century, and any public space, any megapolis today, whether they want it or not, they have to go through transformational process from being industrial center to being center for innovative development. But I'm sure that there's some common recipes, if you will. What common recipes you would give us? What common recipes for transformation you are providing to the heads of the cities you're working with? Thank you.
For that question, and thank you for the invitation here. And Mayor and your team, you deserve an enormous amount of credit for what you've achieved both with this park and this facility, but the broader infrastructure initiatives you have underway. So let me set a context for that question. I think we're going through a period of technological advances and economic restructuring, which really compel cities to think differently about economic strategy and industrial transition. We're seeing a group of next-generation technologies, autonomous vehicles, robotics, genomics, machine learning, the list goes on and on. They're moving from the lab to prototyping to commercialization to startup to scale-ups to mature companies in rapid time. And within a relatively short period, these next-generation technologies are going to be half of global GDP. So the challenge for cities is to be a first mover with 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 of these next generation technologies. Because if you're a first mover, you get the tech jobs, obviously, but you get the multiplier effect, good jobs, quality wages, and in a generational run of growth, inclusive growth. So when we think about an industrial city in the United States that has made this transformation, we think about Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh is a metropolis of about 2.5 million people. It's a city of 300,000 in a county of 1 million. It was the steel capital of the United States, and it literally collapsed overnight in the late 1970s. If you go to Pittsburgh today, it is a literal playground of innovation. And it has a first mover position in many of those next generation technologies. And many Silicon Valley companies have to be in Pittsburgh to do their research and to do their deployment. So the Pittsburgh model was to build on their advanced research institutions, Carnegie Mellon and Pitt, and then pull together the ecosystem of mature companies, of venture capital, of startup scale-ups, incubators, accelerators, technical institutes, and to act like a system, or think like a system, and act like an entrepreneur. So this was about risk-taking over multiple decades, which has put Pittsburgh in this position. So several lessons, which I think apply to megacities as well. The first lesson, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who many might remember here as a great US Senator, said if you want to build a great city, build a great university and wait 200 years. I think the product cycles are moving a little quicker today. I think he was thinking about Harvard, but what we have in the US is MIT and Carnegie Mellon and Georgia Tech and Stanford, and they are the platform for ideas that may be moonshots today, but move from the lab into the market. The second piece is to be an ecosystem rather than an ecosystem. The heads of major universities, medical centers, elected officials, foundations, everyone is running a major concern, and they tend to focus within their organization or entity. But the magic is the network. Cities are networks, not governments. And that requires everyone to sublimate the ego and think about the whole. The third piece is to think about the convergence of technologies, not just clusters of industries and companies. Think about automobiles today. They're computers on wheels. Silicon Valley is as much a part of auto production as Detroit in the United States. So it's the convergence of technology, the software and hardware, which is where the magic is going to happen going forward. Fourth, this is built on what Liz has said, place really matters. The spatial geography of innovation 20 years ago was a business park 30 miles away. You had to get there by car. You go to your office in the morning. If you wanted something to eat, you go in the basement, right? I mean, there was no sense of urbanity, of vibrancy, of vitality. There's a different geography of innovation today. We call it the magic square mile, where people can come together, share ideas, and really create the next advances. And the last piece is institutions matter. I think the biggest concern in the United States today at the local level is that we've inherited a bunch of 20th century institutions that don't quite operate with the agility or the speed or the strategy for the 21st century. So we are rethinking the governance at the district level, at the city level, and at the metropolitan level that's public-private, private-public, private-civic, so that we can begin to build and reap the benefits. And the model, frankly, is not coming out of the US, it's coming out of the Nordics, Copenhagen, or Germany, Hafen City in Hamburg, or the Tegel Airport reconstruction in Berlin. So our sense about economic restructuring today and how a city of Moscow builds off this incredible historic base to leap forward into the future, it's to basically think about these radical changes we're experiencing and how they require a different approach to economic strategy than ones we might have taken literally 10 years ago. It's moving that fast.
Спасибо, Брюс.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, I think that Sergei Semyonovich did not have a chance to wait for 200 years to wait for the great university and then for the great city to build up around it. So we had to begin with yards, with neighborhoods, with theaters. My next question I would like to ask about a culture component in a city. Mr. Kolkhas, you are building both pragmatic utilitarian venues, but you're also an architect of many beautiful culture venues and facilities, concert halls and libraries among them. You've been the author of the Garage project in the Gorky Park, and now I know that you have the great, interesting project of reconstructing Tretakovsky Gallery. And so far we've been speaking about different transformations in the city of Moscow, but I believe those culture venues and facilities which have appeared in Moscow have also become the part of this transformational framework of the city. In your view, these new venues of culture venues and facilities, do they provide this wide effect for the life of the city, this widespread effect for the city and how it is expressed? Thank you.
If you listen to Mr. Katz's kind of vision for Moscow and perhaps for the world, I think that you also hear that there's a kind of vast piece missing. The discourse is about the technology, about the economy, but I think there is an enormous section that is also required for human beings to be happy and to have interesting lives, and that is the section that is not necessarily connected to technology, not necessarily connected to money, and that is a kind of more spiritual and more intellectual section. Russia is perhaps a rare country where these two domains have coexisted in a very intense way. And for instance, if you look at the collection of the Tretyakov Gallery, you see that in the beginning of the 20th century, there was a kind of sense that a new world would emerge, that world would be radically different from the world that we currently inhabit, that it was possible to speculate about its nature, to represent it, and to, in a way, discuss with the population at large what the direction of that world would be. So I think more and more culture institutions are not necessarily kind of museums or concert halls or other kind of really defined entities, but simply a territory where people can enjoy kind of thinking independent of this incredible pressure that is put on everything and which is kind of basically the pressure of technological driven kind of Silicon Valley based model of where the world should go. I think there's still an enormous space to explore which is different from that mentality.
Спасибо.
Thank you.
Mr. Kudrin, do you sometimes go for a walk in Moscow? Yes, of course. Just recently, I joined government service again, and before I did that, I had more free time to do that. Okay, let me ask you something else. When you go out for a walk, do you have places you like to visit? Can you give us a few examples of the places you like to go? Well, this is a surprising question, unexpected. I first came to Moscow when I was a college student, so Tverskoy Boulevard, on the theater. I used to stand in a line there to get a ticket. I only had one evening, and I liked that place, and now I like Bolshaya Nikitskaya Street. It looks very different today from what it used to look like. I often go there, and of course there is one very special place in Moscow. It has to do with my previous job, Ilyinka Street and Birshevaya Square, the place that we saw on that picture, the place that looks very different today. I used to spend a lot of time there. I used to go there for a walk after a working day. Okay, Ilyinka Street, Birshevaya Square. I think you spent decades there working in the government. You were the Minister of Finance. And today, when you go through those favorite places of yours, I would think that people are different today. Their faces, their mood, the atmosphere, the quality of the urban environment has a very strong effect on the way people feel in this environment. But actually, this was kind of leading. My question to you is very different. You're not a regular pedestrian. You're not a regular Muscovite. For years, you were involved in designing economic strategies for our country, especially in recent years, when you were head of the Strategic Studies Center. So, do you see any parallels between the quality of the urban environment and economic growth, the structure of the economy? How much the quality of life in Moscow, how much it determines the country's GDP? I understand this is a macroeconomic question, but you're the right person. Yeah, well, this is in line with the discussion we are having here today. Mr. Mayor said in his keynote address that a new era has, we need to develop the urban environment as an ecosystem. And Bruce Kotz added that this involves intellectual development, innovation, things that accelerate our development today, creates added value. Well, I would like to add something else. We see new trends in the world today, what we call creative industry. Usually this happens in cities. This combines universities, creative potential, culture, arts, movies, even in the iPhone. 70% engineers tell me that the creators of the iPhone say that 70% of it is design, art, dialogue between man and the machine. This is the kind of specialists we need today, and this happens in cities. But this kind of creative people who work on these kind of things, they need a special kind of environment for them to do their job. So, you have these creative industries today which include culture and arts. For example, this concert hall, this is an important achievement. This is an important contribution to the economic dimension of Moscow, too. This is what generates this environment. I would like actually to add a few words about this concert hall, because it was built, you know, the statement of work was prepared by my friend Valery Gergiev, who is the artistic director of the Mariinsky Theater. He invested a lot of effort in this concert hall. This project brought Moscow and St. Petersburg together in a very good way. I think this is another reason why people will love this place, because this hall has one of the best acoustic systems in Russia, just like the Mariinsky Theater has a very good acoustic system. So I think acoustics should help the city authorities and the people of Moscow come to some kind of understanding, find common ground. Okay, creative industries, even today, at the time of a crisis, they're well ahead of all the other industries. They create added value for cities like Moscow. So, personally, I believe we should develop this not only in Moscow, because in Moscow we have a very good foundation. We have universities, and I'm not only referring to conventional universities like Moscow State University, which is, I think, 260 years ago, but the Higher School of Economics, the Shanin School, schools that are only 20 or 30 years old. These are breakthrough universities, very good universities, which also create a very good platform for innovation. So these are the things that will drive the Russian economy. Let me give you a few figures. Moscow and the Moscow Oblast, the agglomeration, generate about 26% of Russia's GDP today. If you add St. Petersburg and the area around it, Moscow and St. Petersburg account for 42% of Russia's GDP. About 15 years ago, this figure was only, I think, 25%. Moscow and St. Petersburg were only 25%. So the share of Moscow and St. Petersburg is growing in the Russian economy. Why? Because these two cities come up with new solutions, new technology, new kind of knowledge, new education. This is just one of the areas that need to develop, and this has been mentioned earlier today. But if we continue with this inertia in other parts of Russia, very soon Moscow and St. Petersburg will account for more than 40% of GDP. What we need in Russia is more megacities like Moscow and St. Petersburg in other parts of Russia. They should offer the same standard of living. They should also come up with new solutions, bringing together intellectual potential, industrial potential, economic potential, transport, hubs, connections, bringing different parts of Russia together. I think we can have a very big agglomeration around Yekaterinburg in the Urals. In the Volga area, we can do the same. In Siberia, we should have the same thing in Novosibirsk. We should help other cities around Russia to follow this path. So I really hope we don't only talk about Moscow at this forum today, we should also talk about other agglomerations in Russia. One day, eventually, they can become competitors for Moscow and St. Petersburg, our two leading agglomerations. So I can tell you, Novosibirsk is known around the world. You know, they have Creative Capital Index. This is an index that we designed together with the Coward 22. It's an international company, and PwC, the audit company, we worked together on this project. And so now we have a way, we have methodology to calculate Creative Capital Index for different parts of the country. We use hundreds of different indicators. We use statistics and subjective indicators. And we saw that suddenly St. Petersburg is ahead of Moscow and other cities in terms of some creative indices, because they have a special law for supporting creative industries. Number 3 has always been Yekaterinburg. Moscow, St. Petersburg, then Yekaterinburg. That's because of architecture and design. But Kazan, the city of Kazan, is ranked 4th because they have very good IT sector. And these cities are very good centers for creating new agglomerations, connecting neighboring areas. And I hope that the government will pay special attention to developing transport infrastructure. We should have more horizontal ties between different parts of Russia, between different regions of Russia. This will generate new opportunities. This creates added value. This will make those parts of Russia grow. So on the average, Russia will grow at 3 to 4% a year, but these advanced regions will grow at the pace of 4 to 6% a year. They will create new opportunities for Russia. And in conclusion, I'd like to say that the goals, the ambitious goals that our country has today, increasing the longevity, life expectancy, the quality of life, the quality of education, because of the role that Moscow plays in Russia, I think at least 25% of those goals will be achieved in Russia. So this is a great responsibility for the city. We should look at the ways to take a giant leap forward and achieve these goals. I think Moscow has a good chance of achieving them. Thank you, Mr. Kudrin. When I prepared for this session, I used this study you referred to, the Creative Capital Index for different cities, and I discovered something interesting. For our economy to grow at 3% a year, megacities like Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Kazan should grow at the rate of 6 to 7% a year. And this is a serious challenge, but still, I believe this is also great responsibility, a very prominent role that these cities can play. Colleagues, I would like to ask a question. Actually, Mr. Sobyanin has already answered this question in his address, so maybe this is a very short question and I need short answers from all of you. Just 1 or 2 sentences per person. What do you think are the greatest challenges that Moscow will face, that Moscow faces today or will face in the next 50 years? What is the greatest challenge for Moscow? Very briefly, because we need to close the plenary session. I would like to ask everybody except for Mr. Sobyanin, because I will have a separate question for you. I think you have given an answer to. So, Mr. Kotz, how about we start with you?
Challenge is for Moscow and many other cities around the world to become one of those few 3, 5, 7 cities that are seen as constantly creating the next generation of technologies that improve urban life. This is about urban tech, not tech in general. So 10 years from now, 15 years from now, are we going to see 15, 25, 35 companies coming out of Moscow continuously because of your centers of academic excellence that are going to move us fast forward on renewable energy or fast forward on other urban-related technologies? That's the challenge.
Отличный ответ. Спасибо большое.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you. Mr. Kohlhaas, what is your answer?
The challenge for Russia is not only to think about its cities, but also to find a way to cultivate and to appropriate and to inhabit and to find a relationship with its immense and unbelievably powerful countryside.
Спасибо. Алексей Леонидович, ваш взгляд.
Mr. Kudrin, I've already answered this question. I can only repeat myself. If we take a traditional approach in developing Russia's region, Moscow will have a very good development, absorbing people from attracting people from all over Russia, and this will be a loss for the country as a whole. So we shouldn't develop too far and making this agglomeration even bigger. There are certain limits to this process. Otherwise, this agglomeration will no longer be comfortable for living. And actually, Moscow should catch up with other global centers. In another study we did, another part of our Creative Capital Index, we studied 8 megacities around the world. Currently, Moscow is ranked 8th in terms of the relationship between the authorities and creative people. So we need to focus more on something that Mr. Sobyanin mentioned in his address, trust between the authorities and the people. Communications. I think this is a new challenge for Moscow. Thank you. Elizabeth.
Okay, fast.
Please.
I would say in its growth to avoid rapid gentrification, to preserve and enhance diversification, social diversification, and economic diversification, and get rid of cars.
Спасибо. Сергей Семенович, когда мы готовились...
Mr. Sobyanin, as we prepared for this session, I wrote down my last question to the mayor at the end of the plenary session. It's a traditional question that people often ask in plenary session. Have you heard something new today? But as I was sitting here, I thought, oh, this is such a standard boilerplate question. After you spent 8 years as Moscow mayor, after you worked in the government for so long, can I really ask you if you heard something new sitting here today? Because in your address, you made it very clear that you have a clear vision of what you need to get done in Moscow. So I will change my question. I will ask you something different now. My quick question was about greatest challenges facing Moscow in the future. What about you personally? What is your biggest challenge? You know, Mr. Kudrin gave a very good definition of it. He said, let's limit Moscow in its development. We can overcome traffic jams, garbage, problems with healthcare, education, but we will never able to overcome it if we are limited in our development. You know, this is a very vital idea. You know, during the Tsar period, they moved the capital from Moscow because they said Moscow is going to die. Let's move away. Moscow is a city of merchants. We hate those people, so they moved the capital to St. Petersburg. But Moscow kept on living and developing. Then during the Soviet period, as the authorities would expel all the dissidents, make them move hundreds of kilometers away from Moscow. And they had a clear limit. We only need so many people in Moscow, everybody else should go elsewhere. And what happened in the end? Moscow kept spreading. They went beyond the Boulevard Ring, went beyond Garden Ring. Then there was the Moscow Circle Road, MKAD, city limits. Okay, so we have a new limit to the city, the Circle Road. Let's not deceive ourselves. Moscow stepped beyond MKAD, and we have 8 million people living outside the city limits. These are new boundaries of the cities. They're not officially Moscow residents, but they work in Moscow, they come to Moscow, they commute every day. Any attempt to limit Moscow's development through administrative measures will only cause us to lose a competitive edge. We are not competing against Ryazan or Vologda. We are competing against New York, London, and Paris. Nobody. In New York, they're not talking about limiting New York's development. Moscow is not a problem. Moscow is an asset of Russia. It's the locomotive of Russia's development. And personally, I think we should do our best. We should all work together to make sure that people living in Moscow and outside Moscow can have a comfortable life living for our country, for the future of our city and our country, loving our city. Thank you. Thank you. Colleagues, the forum has just started its work. We have 2 days ahead of us, 80 different events. Vice mayors will give their briefings on their respective areas of responsibility. And then at the end of the day, Mr. Kohlhaas will be interviewed by Vladimir Pozner. So let's get on with our work. I think we had a very good start in this session. So let's continue. Thank you very much.